beautiful people, and welcome to the About That podcast with me, your host, your favorite geek psychologist, your favorite pop culture enthusiast, your favorite queen of the nerds, Dr. Vanessa Hintz. Today, lovely humans, our topic of conversation is none other than the 2023 summer blockbuster, Barbie, the Barbie movie. I have been waiting for the opportunity to dive into all the things, right? This movie made $1 billion. Okay, it made $1 billion. So it was all over everywhere. It's still all over everywhere. And I have a lot to say. I have a lot to say about it. And so we are going to get right into it. First and foremost, I'm going to say I loved it. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I loved it. And I didn't love it immediately. I went to go see it with my mom probably like 2 weeks after it came out, because I think the weekend that the movie came out, I think it was actually the weekend of San Diego Comic-Con, and so I was in San Diego. And then the next weekend, my mom was like, we gotta go see it, because I was just hearing all these amazing things, and I was like, okay, cool. And so the first time I saw it, I was kind of like, all right, like that was cool. And I think if you have listened to other episodes of the podcast, you probably heard me say the first time I watch anything, like I don't like it. It takes me a minute. And like, I think the first time I'm just such a harsh critic that I'm kind of like, for every film that I watch. And then I have to go back and watch it again. And then I, have all these epiphanies, right? So I don't know why. I just know that's my way. And so I watched it the first time in theaters, and I was like, okay, like that was a lot different than I thought it was going to be. And since watching it in the theaters for the first time, I've probably seen it, I don't know how many times since, because I just watch it all the time. I own it. I just watch it whenever I want. It makes me happy. Ryan Gosling is just giving in it the whole time. All them Kens, you know what I'm saying? But that's further on down. We'll talk about that. Anyways, it brings me joy. It's just so happy. It's so campy. I love it, right? And so I love it. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I love it. I'm going to also talk to you a little bit about why I think it was so popular, and also some messages that I feel like we can take from it, right? Like how can we use this thing that is so popular, Barbie is so well known worldwide. How can this film help to heal? That's always my goal when I talk about things on this podcast. How can these things help us to heal, whether that be us individually? How can it help us to feel affirmed? How can it help us to find community and a sense of belonging? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. First and foremost, though, some Barbie movie 101. I'm going to read you the description of the film from IMDb. Quote, Barbie and Ken are having the time of their lives in the colorful and seemingly perfect world of Barbie Land. However, when they get a chance to go to the real world, they soon discover the joys and perils of living among humans. End quote. Again, that is the description on IMDb. Conversely, so Barbie as a Warner Brothers product is streaming on Max, previously called HBO Max, now called Max. The description of the film on HBO Max/Max reads, and I quote, to live in Barbie Land is to be a perfect being in a perfect place, unless you have a full-on existential crisis, or you're a Ken. End quote. I just want to take a minute to juxtapose those two descriptions, right? I don't know who, how, where, why people get descriptions on IMDb. Like, I don't know if people just write them randomly, whatever. It's just interesting to me as someone who saw the film. In this first description I read from IMDb, Barbie and Ken live in a perfect world. When they get a chance to see what reality is like, it's like, whoa, right? And this HBO Max description is talking more about this sort of existential crisis that I would argue was at the center of the film, and does so in a way that I think is less, I don't want to say negative, that's not the right word. There's less of a value judgment on it, right? And so just very, 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 very interesting to me in terms of, and I would say that mirrors a lot of, I think the film was very divisive in that, like, there are people that really loved it. There are people that really hated it. I think there were kind of some people in between. But people on either sides of those spectrums, people that really loved it or people that really hated it, are loud about it, right? We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But as I referenced, according to Box Office Mojo, Barbie has made $1.4 billion worldwide. Billion with a B. 1.4 Bs worldwide. And so that in itself is phenomenal, right? And so the first thing I want to talk about with regard to Barbie, which I think is probably one of the most obvious things and something that ever since the movie was announced, ever since Margot Robbie was announced as, the title character, this is truly capitalizing on a sense of nostalgia. I talked about this before in my episode about Stranger Things, right? Like, there is money to be made in nostalgia. Nostalgia is powerful. And as a reminder, according to the APA, American Psychological Association Dictionary of Psychology, nostalgia is, quote, a longing to return to an earlier period or condition of life, recalled as being better than the present in some way. And so how Hollywood capitalizes on nostalgia is by tapping into our feels about what it was like to be younger and to not have adult responsibilities and not have to pay bills, right? Like, what was it like for young people to play with Barbie? What did it feel like when you were young? What was that childlike joy or adult joy? Whatever, whenever you were, whatever. But nostalgia, Hollywood capitalizes on that, right? Because more often than not, nostalgia is sort of this perspective that I'm looking back in a loving way, right? Hollywood does this by capitalizing on the connections that we already have with our favorite characters, right? So not only are we tapping into this feeling of nostalgia about, days since past that were better than the present in some way, but also, especially a character as recognizable as Barbie, people feel some kind of way about that already, right? And so Hollywood is about to cash in and get them coins, right? And so we have, it's not news that the reboot has become an established genre in Hollywood. I am proud to say that the horror genre boasts the highest percentage of reboots. I don't know if that's good, bad, or otherwise, but what's up? Y'all know that's my first love. Reboots, remakes, reimaginings, all different kinds of things that fall sort of under this genre, the reboot genre umbrella. And so reboots reset the chronology that has been established over multiple films. And so we're just going to throw that whole part of the story away and we're going to start something else. I can speak Friday the 13th. There are 9 films. And then they made Jason X, and is it connected to the other ones? I don't know. But then there was a reboot in 2009, and so it didn't have anything to do with any of those other films, right? So reboot, exactly like it says, right? They reset the chronology. Remakes, on the other hand, tend to update just a single film, and on average, Hollywood waits about 23 years before producing a remake of an original film, and so there's a movie, and then later we're going to get some sort of continuation of that film or whatever. I don't know. That's a remake. And then lastly, reimaginings add to or change original films, altering them in a major way. I would argue one of the most prominent reimaginings that we saw in 2023 was The Little Mermaid. And so there was like an established narrative, an established character that was reimagined in a different way, to many people's chagrins, to my delight, but that's a conversation on 2 other episodes of this podcast, so you should check them out. Anyways, much like with The Little Mermaid, Hollywood capitalized on this nostalgia with Barbie, and Barbie, again, is nostalgic to so many people worldwide, and I'm just going to read some statistics, some facts that I found about the power of Barbie, and this is from the website barbiemedia.com. These statistics are from, and this sort of data is from 2022. So it will likely is different following the success of the film, but nonetheless. Barbie is the most popular fashion doll ever produced and the #1 fashion doll property. A Barbie dream house is sold every 2 minutes and was first introduced in 1962. Barbie is the most diverse fashion doll on the market. More than 100 Barbie dolls are sold every minute. Barbie is sold in 150 countries worldwide. Barbie has products in over 50 categories, including food, fitness, and clothing. The Barbie brand has over 99% brand awareness globally. The Barbie YouTube channel has over 20 million global subscribers and 23 billion minutes of content watched, making Barbie the #1 girls brand on YouTube. Barbie apps average more than 7 million monthly active users. And finally, Barbie has a powerful social media presence with over 19 million followers across platforms. Barbie is the #1 toy brand in social conversation. End quote. That is the power of Barbie. That is the power of nostalgia. So Barbie is not only recognizable just because of all those things that I just said. In addition, that recognition evokes feelings that lead people to go watch a film about Barbie, right? And so nostalgia is powerful. Nostalgia is powerful. Recognition is powerful. And y'all know this is about to go left because I'm me. What I want to consider for the remainder of our conversation, particularly around nostalgia, and again, this is something I talked about with regard to Stranger Things. What is nostalgia? What is the period that we are lovingly looking back on with pride and with longing? What is that for people who are marginalized? What glory days are we looking back to as women of color, as people of color, as members of the queer community? What are the good old days? What is nostalgia to those who are historically disempowered? And y'all knew it wasn't going to be all sunshine and rainbows because, again, I'm me. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this because I don't think that the answer to that question has to be something super morbid. What I do think, and what I think Barbie did well, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this, is to acknowledge, as women, what nostalgic past are we looking to? And particularly, as a woman of color, what nostalgic past am I looking to? Because again, when we think about nostalgia, there is a connotation of positivity. I'm looking back on the past, or I'm looking back on a time that made me feel positive. What is that time for people who have never experienced equity? What is that time for people who have been disempowered? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And so for many, Barbie is considered sort of like a feminist film. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I don't necessarily like that. And so, again, returning to the American Psychological Association Dictionary of Psychology, feminism refers to, quote, any of a number of perspectives that take as their subject matter the problems and perspectives of women or the nature of biological and social phenomena related to gender, end quote. So what I think is important to sort of first delineate within this context is the difference between gender identity, gender expression, and sex assigned at birth. So sex assigned at birth is exactly what it sounds like. When you are born, there is a biological or natal sex that is assigned to you, most often male or female, sometimes intersex, right? So that is sex assigned at birth. Gender identity is how you identify along the spectrum of gender. And I say spectrum, and I would say it's maybe man on one side, woman on the other, and then fluidity in between, right? So gender identity, what is my gender? How do I feel? Not what was my sex assigned at birth. Sometimes there is congruence between those things. That is what we call being cisgender. My identity matches my sex assigned at birth. And then lastly, gender expression. So this typically exists on a spectrum between masculine and feminine. And so I would identify as a feminine cisgendered woman. So I am biologically female. I identify as a woman, and my presentation tends to be feminine, right? And so those three things, sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, three very distinct things that may or may not be, quote, I don't even want to say congruent, because congruence is a societal construct, right? So who says that if I'm a woman, I have to be feminine? And so again, I think it's important as we move forward and we're talking about feminism and we're talking about women's issues, I would say that Barbie catered to and spoke about very specific subset of women, and that is cis, I would argue hetero women, right? And I'm not saying that that's good, better, otherwise. That is my interpretation. I want to also acknowledge that there is space, opportunity to talk about the impacts of the film for people that do not fit that categorization of women. That is not what I'm going to talk about as I move forward, and I want to acknowledge that there is a space to talk about that, right? So again, as we move forward with that context, I want to share, I found an article from theeverygirl.com from last year, right after the movie was released. And they identified in this article 6 lessons from the Barbie movie. And I invite you all to keep in mind this sort of conceptualization, this contextualization of gender identity, gender expression, as I outline these lessons identified in the article. And so the first lesson, taken from the Barbie movie, according to this article, quote, "Girls can do anything, and it's okay if you find that absolutely exhausting." I think one of the most famous, for lack of a better word, one of the most recognizable aspects of the film, besides I'm Just Ken, I think the song, I love that song, was Gloria's speech. Gloria, played by America Ferrera. Her speech, right, about that starts with "It is literally impossible to be a woman," and she goes through this entire speech about the contradictions of the patriarchy and all of these things. We can do everything, so we must, right? And I talk about this a little bit in episode, I think it's 10, related to Shiroism. But again, I think that was something that was very beautifully communicated in the film, particularly in this dynamic between Gloria and stereotypical Barbie, or Margot Robbie's character, right? So girls can do anything, and it's okay if you find that exhausting. Lesson 2, different generations of feminists can find common ground. I think we see that most with the dynamic between Sasha, Gloria, and stereotypical Barbie, right? I would say the Barbies, generally speaking. We see in the film that the Barbies are under the impression that they have sort of fixed the issues of inequity, gender inequity. And when Barbie comes to the real world and realizes that is indeed not the case, how do we then rally around a common cause and of addressing inequity? I think initially what I appreciate about the film is that initially we sort of see this conflict between Sasha, her mom, Gloria, and stereotypical Barbie, and then they return to Barbie Land and the Kens have got everything turned up and they're doing what they're doing, and they sort of rally together because the common enemy is inequity. The common enemy is patriarchy, and so we cannot be squabbling amongst ourselves. We have to sort of face and address this power imbalance, this inequity, right? So kudos. Absolutely amazing. Third lesson from Barbie, according to this article, quote, "Extremes of masculinity and femininity are damaging to everyone." And I would say that this line of thinking, I think, was most evident in a lot of the backlash that the movie got, particularly from cis-het men, around how the Kens were treated, right, in the film. And so we see in the beginning, the Kens are sort of, again, and I think Margot Robbie, there's a quote in the movie where she says, Ken is absolutely superfluous. And so they are seen as extensions of Barbies, right? And so one could argue that is an extreme, quote, put that in quotes, extreme ideal of femininity. And then sort of the other end of that spectrum is what we see when Ken returns and brings patriarchy to Barbie Land. Now we have sort of this extreme masculine, extreme patriarchy, this sort of patriarchal ideal. And so I would say that the way in this film, there were these sort of depictions of, we want to be somewhere in the middle, right? We want to be somewhere in the middle concerning power, we want to balance power, ostensibly. And I have something to say about that in terms of yes, and when we're doing equity work, it hit different, right? It hit a little bit different. And yes, we want to eventually get to a place where there is an equitable distribution of power. How we get there, though, is not everybody gets the same thing all the time. You know what I'm saying? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. Fourth lesson from the Barbie movie, according to theeverygirl.com, quote, "It is not women's burden to fix men who do not yet know themselves." Yes. Yes. And this, again, I think of many of these lessons that I am going to relay. This is the one that I think is, again, couched in a very specific context, a very cis, very hetero context. I would say, as, again, a cisgendered, heterosexual black woman, yes. And I think there is more room, more space to contextualize that, quote, lesson in a way that is more inclusive. Let me say that. And again, and this is something, at Emerald City Comic Con this past February, me and two amazing human beings did a panel on Barbie. And one of those human beings, Elena, mentioned just because we wanted more from the Barbie movie doesn't mean that we can't appreciate what it gave us, right? And this is something that I want to sort of underscore, particularly as we're talking about this lesson, is just because it didn't give us everything doesn't mean it didn't give us anything. You know what I'm saying? And so I think there is space to be critical of the Barbie movie without disparaging what it did provide. And I think this is an example of that, right? So again, as a cishet woman in a marriage with a cishet man, it is not my burden to fix a man who does not yet know him. That means something to me, right? It may not mean something to everybody else, right? And that doesn't mean that we negate that lesson because it's not for everyone. You know what I'm saying? What we do is acknowledge that and make space for conversation about that, right? So I also just want to say, I'm not saying my husband don't yet know himself. I don't want nobody coming for me like I just was disparaging about my husband. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Moving on. Lesson number 5, quote, "Womanhood is a constant balance of contradictions, and recognizing that is empowering." Again, returning to the speech that Gloria gave, that's how they started to deprogram all the Barbies. And I love the fact that they use the term deprogram. As someone who does justice work, as someone who advocates for justice work and equity, oftentimes that work requires us to disavow ourselves from the, quote, norm, because we know that the norm, the, quote, status quo, all of those things are inequitable. And so if we want to truly move towards equity, if we want to truly move towards a space where there is a balance of power, we have to disavow ourselves from this imbalanced system. And that requires a deprogramming. And so to me, the depiction of deprogramming the Barbies, just absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful, because again, to me, that was so symbolic of what I not only do for myself every single day, trying to exist as a black woman in the world, right? But what I also advocate for other people to do who really want to engage very deeply, again, with equity work and with justice work. And then lastly, from this article, the 6th lesson from the Barbie movie is, quote, "We need more female directors in Hollywood." Point blank, period. I would agree. We need to uplift more marginalized voices in Hollywood. I think what happened with the 2024 Oscars and the whole outrage around the Barbie movie's sort of lack of recognition, I think is there's a whole conversation to be had about that we will have a different day. And I think that it is also indicative of the fact that there's still so much further we need to go concerning equity in Hollywood, equity in artistry, equity in creation. And so, again, all those things I just referenced, I think, are what many would point to as sort of like feminist lessons from the Barbie movie. And what I want to talk a little bit about now is the difference between feminism and womanism. Because to speak very transparently, I don't like the word feminist. I would not identify myself as a feminist. Because for me, historically, feminism has been exclusionary feminism has been exclusive to, again, cis white women, right? And oftentimes cis het white women. And so, again, that doesn't mean I think we should just throw feminism away. That's not what I said. It does mean, though, that I think womanism is something that is more aligned and congruent with my values and with my lived experiences. And so womanism, this term actually originates from the Black colloquial term womanish, which refers to the courageous, knowledge-seeking, and willful behavior of young Black women. I believe womanism was first coined by Alice Walker, and again is to me an expansive view of feminism that includes the lived experiences of women of color. I would also say as women, trans women, and marginalized women, right? And womanism challenges all forms of oppression. It centralizes everyday people and their lived experiences. It rejects rigid ideologies, and it embraces, again, the commonwealth and recognizes the importance of activism. And so I think what feminism claimed to do and claims to do, womanism does for all folk, all marginalized folk, right? Because again, feminism, I think, traditionally has been exclusionary. That doesn't mean everybody who's a feminist is exclusionary. Again, I think generally speaking, historically, it has been as such. Womanism really exemplifies this intersectional critical consciousness. Again, so when we think about the experiences of marginalized people, it's not I am a woman, so then therefore blah, 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 blah. Because again, like, we are all intersectional beings. And so there are so many different socio-political forces that influence and shape our experiences. And again, for women of color, for trans women, for women with disabilities, traditional, quote, traditional feminism may not be best representative of your experiences, right? It might not, you know what I'm saying? And that's why I think for many people, womanism, again, is more inclusive, right? Similarly, I think just one concept I wanted to sort of share with you all along the same lines is this idea of gendered racism, right? And so for women of color, environments in which they experience sexism are also sort of rife with racism. And it is impossible, and I would argue problematic, to either or that, right? Like, so either you're discriminated against because of your sex or because of racism. And if you understand the history of intersectionality, this is part of how this came into the discourse, right? Kimberly Crenshaw talks about this in terms of representing a woman with a discrimination case at her job, and the court wanted her to sort of differentiate, well, was it sexism or was it racism? And Kimberly Crenshaw's response is, you cannot differentiate. Like, how do you separate that, right? Gendered racism refers to this racial oppression of women of color that is both cultivated by sort of racist ideology as well as gender-based discrimination. And so, again, one thing that I appreciate about the Barbie movie is that at face value, particularly given Margot Robbie is the title character and she is, quote, stereotypical Barbie, what I would say is I think that for me, and again, this is my interpretation, my experience of the film, what I referenced in terms of, you know, Gloria's speech about it is literally impossible to be a woman, deprogramming is essential to moving forward and battling patriarchy. These things, to me, are indicative of womanism. I think, you know, in the scene where Gloria gives her speech and then stereotypical Barbie sort of comes to this realization like, oh my gosh, everything that you just said, you know, help snap me out of it. And it's Sasha who stands up and I think she says, hell yeah, white savior Barbie. And stereotypical Barbie says, no, that wasn't me. That was your mom. You know what I'm saying? And being like, even that little sort of like, no, that wasn't me. That was your mom. This woman of color that's standing right here in front of us, right? Like, that was super dope to me. Super dope. And I think that, again, everything that Gloria mentioned in that speech about the contradictions around what it means to be a woman and femininity and all of these different things, I think it's important to acknowledge that when we add additional intersections of race, of disability, of queerness, of whatever, right? Those things change. And that is what womanism is about, is understanding that everything that Gloria said in that speech about what it means to be a woman, femininity, all of that is one piece of the puzzle. One piece of the puzzle, right? And as a psychologist, I appreciate the perspective of womanism in sort of like the practice and understanding of psychology too, in that, as I mentioned before, it really requires this like critical consciousness and understanding that each individual person, each individual woman is not only sort of dealing with her own unique context, but also these larger contextual factors. So again, what my experience is like as a biracial black cishet woman is very different than what a trans white woman will experience, right? And that doesn't mean it's better or worse. It just means that it's different. Womanism really acknowledges that we have to consider all of these contextual factors in a way that I think feminism does not readily do. And that is something I think in the Barbie movie that I think was there, could have been there more. It absolutely was there though, right? In terms of, again, even that little space of Sasha saying, calling her white savior Barbie, and then Margot Robbie saying, no, I didn't save shit. That was your mom, right? And so I think that though, for me, when I think about, again, how I would utilize this film to talk about womanhood and femininity, it is from this lens of womanism, right? Not necessarily feminism. Because again, in my opinion, womanism can be a protective factor in the face of discrimination, because it is acknowledging that for women of color, for trans women, for disabled women, for queer women, you are dealing with multiple systems of oppression that combine in very unique ways to disadvantage you. And that, to me, again, is not necessarily adequately expressed in feminist thought, not necessarily adequately expressed in this film. And I think this film provided a platform for me to have this discussion. I think it will continue to provide a platform for people to have these discussions about feminism and what it means to be a woman. And so why, dear friends, is any of that important? I'm going to speak to this from the perspective of a mental health practitioner, and to speak specifically on the mental health of women and girls. And so just some statistics to share with you all. So 1 in 4 women have received treatment for mental health in the last year. Women have a higher prevalence of depression and anxiety. And when they present with the exact same symptoms as their male counterparts, as men, women are more likely to be diagnosed with depression and prescribed medication. Women are more likely to take medication and are more likely to receive treatment for mental health, arguably because of the stigma surrounding masculinity and vulnerability, and a conversation for a different day. Women are also less likely to disclose problems related to substance use or victimization. And again, this is a conversation for a different day. Another tangent that we can go down in talking about victimization is how frequently women are victimized, and the correlation between that frequency of victimization and a reluctance to disclose, how that impacts women's lived experiences, right? Women's ways of being in the world. And it is difficult for women to get treatment, particularly women who are marginalized, women of color, disabled women, queer women, because of stigma, because of cost, because of a lack of access to care, because of a lack of time and support, and I would argue because of a lack of understanding of oppressive systems on the part of the therapist, right? So if you, as a woman, and a woman who experiences multiple systems of oppression, go to a provider who does not have an understanding of that, the likelihood of re-victimization by a system is very high, right? And so why is any of this that we're talking about important? Why is womanism important? Why is pulling these messages from the Barbie movie important? Why is any of this important? It is important because we need to promote wellness, safety and value for women and girls, and that is all women and girls. Trans women, queer women, women of color, disabled women, all women of low socioeconomic status, right? Like, this movie, the lessons in this movie are not just for cishet white women, right? Albeit on the surface, it may very much seem so, right? And that was my hope with this conversation. That was my hope with this analysis, is for people to maybe get a little kernel, get a little nugget of wisdom, right? That maybe you hadn't thought about before, and also to make space and to advocate for women that exist at these intersections, and women who are oftentimes pressured to reduce themselves and their identities to this or that. And I'm here, and womanism is here to argue that no, the HU do not have to do that. You are uniquely you. You are uniquely you. You are a unique cultural constellation, and do not, should not, shall not be reduced to anything other than what makes you beautifully and complexly, is that a word? Complexly you. Point blank, period. And with that brings me to my about that moment, about the Barbie movie. So, y'all know me. I'm going to end with the compliment sandwich. Good, not so good, good. So one of my most favorite things about the Barbie movie, which I didn't talk about here for many reasons, absolutely Ken. Ken, all the Kens. Ken's own sort of journey to realizing that he is Kenough. To me, that was dope in its own right? I would say, too, I ain't got no shame. I was blinded by Ryan Gosling and his platinum hair and his abs that I thought were drawn on, but they were absolutely real. I'm Just Ken. I love that song. I sing it with my whole chest every time I hear it. Absolutely love everything about it. Another thing that I sort of loved about this, the last conversation that stereotypical Barbie had with Ken, again, I think there were problems there. I think there's definitely, conversations we could have about all the things that I wish were different. And one thing that I appreciated was, Margot Robbie's character's insistence that it's Barbie and it's Ken, not it's Barbie and Ken. And so I think that again, that sort of nuanced of you are uniquely and individually you, whether society juxtaposes you with this other person or whatever, right? Like, I just think I appreciated it, right? I appreciated it. And I know a lot of the vitriol about the movie, again, was the treatment of the Kens, the placement of the Kens, all these different things. It's a yes and for me. Like, yes, there were issues and I loved it. Something that I feel like was not so good about the Barbie movie, and this is how I felt initially after the first time I watched it, I felt like it needed to be longer. I felt like for what was being done, for what was the messages that were being I feel like it just needed a little bit more space to breathe. It was only about, I think, 90 minutes, maybe a little bit more. And again, I think in today's day and age, particularly after everything of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like, that's not very long at all. And so I wish that the movie was longer. I wish there would have been more space to navigate some of these things. The fact that Sasha is like a biracial Latina girl, I think, and her seemingly white dad is trying to learn Spanish. Like, I feel like that there was a conversation to be had there. Will Ferrell's whole vibe, like, I was very confused as to, like, is this satirical? Like, what are we doing? Like, it was just, I wish it had more space. I wish it had more space to breathe. And lastly, I think what I appreciate about the film is sort of the intentional use of language, explicit discussion, and use of words like patriarchy, and Gloria's whole speech, and the way that there was an intentionality behind conveying this message in a way that was clear and was not shrouded in this other sort of like, well, maybe we're just going to skirt around it. Like, no, we're using very specific words. I think even the ending scene where, spoiler alert, stereotypical Barbie decides that she wants to become human, and what does she do? She goes to the gynecologist, right? And I think that there was a beauty about that, because I think that so often, given the way women's bodies are governed and how we sort of shy away from having conversations about bodies and, like vaginas and ovaries in a very explicit way. And so one thing again that I think was just absolutely phenomenal and brilliant was the explicit discussion of patriarchy, of inequity, and again the intentional use of language. And so if you have not already, my hope is that this conversation has motivated you to watch the Barbie movie. If nothing, it is visually, I think, very beautiful. It's very colorful. To me, it was very fun. And again, it's 90 minutes. So if you absolutely hate it, it's only 90 minutes of your life, right? I hope, and I really am going to send vibes into the world that you will watch it and you will love it. And then you can hit me up and we'll talk about it. And so until that point, my dear friends, I wish you and your family safety, health, and joy. Until next time, good people.